I was halfway through clearing my driveway in suburban Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when I saw her storming across the street like a woman on a mission, her bright pink parka making her impossible to miss against the fresh February snow. My hands were numb despite my insulated gloves, and the last thing I needed was whatever drama was about to unfold. But I'd learned in my 3 years living in Oakwood Meadows that avoiding Brenda Morrison, HOA president and professional neighborhood busybody, was about as possible as stopping a Wisconsin blizzard with an umbrella. "Excuse me, excuse me," she shouted over the roar of my snowblower, waving her arms like she was directing aircraft on a carrier deck. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt almost aggressive. My breath came out in white puffs as I turned to face her. "Morning, Brenda. What can I do for you?" "What you can do," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that only comes from reading too many HOA bylaws before bed, "is explain why you haven't helped clear Mrs. Patterson's driveway yet. She's 83 years old, Owen, and her driveway is a safety hazard." Owen Tanner, that's me. Firefighter for the past 8 years at Station 47, which was actually visible from my street if you squinted past the cluster of oak trees that gave our development its name. I bought this house because it was close to the station, had a decent garage for my woodworking hobby, and the HOA seemed relatively sane at the time. That last part turned out to be optimistic thinking. "I've been working a 48-hour shift, Brenda. Just got home an hour ago. I'm clearing my own driveway so I can actually park my truck in the garage." She planted her hands on her hips, and I noticed she was wearing fuzzy boots that had absolutely no business being out in 8 inches of fresh powder. "That's very selfish of you. The HOA handbook clearly states that residents should assist elderly neighbors during inclement weather. Pretty sure the handbook says we should consider helping, not that it's mandatory, and I will help Mrs. Patterson, right after I finish my own driveway and maybe get a cup of coffee in me." Brenda's eyes narrowed, and then she looked at my snowblower like she'd just discovered plutonium in my garage. It was a nice machine, a professional-grade Ariens with more power than most homeowners needed, but when you grew up in northern Wisconsin like I did, you learned that investing in good snow removal equipment wasn't optional. "Actually," she said, and I knew from her tone that whatever came next was going to test my patience, "I think the most efficient solution would be for me to take your snowblower and clear Mrs. Patterson's driveway while you finish yours manually with a shovel. That way, we're both being productive." I blinked at her. "You want to take my snowblower, borrow it, for the good of the community? Brenda, do you even know how to operate a snowblower? How hard can it be? You just push it and it clears snow. I'm perfectly capable of handling machinery." She reached for the handle like the conversation was over. I stepped between her and my equipment. "First, it's not that simple. Second, this is my personal property. And third, even if I was inclined to lend it out, which I'm not before I've had coffee and cleared my own driveway, I'd need to make sure whoever's using it knows what they're doing. These things can be dangerous." Her face flushed red, which had nothing to do with the cold. "Dangerous. Don't be ridiculous. I'm the HOA president and I'm requisitioning this equipment for community use. The bylaws give me the authority to coordinate community resources during emergencies. Coordinate, maybe. Commandeer, no. And this isn't an emergency. It's February in Wisconsin. Snow happens. Mrs. Patterson could fall and break her hip, which is why I'll help her after I finish here. Like I said." Brenda's mouth opened and closed a few times, and I could practically see her scrolling through her mental Rolodex of HOA regulations, looking for something that would give her leverage. Then her eyes landed on the side of my snowblower, and her expression changed from frustrated to triumphant so fast, I actually felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Is that a fire department logo?" she asked, pointing at the red and gold emblem I'd put on the housing. It was a custom decal, Station 47 insignia, something I'd added mostly because I was proud of where I worked and because it helped me identify my stuff when I loaned it to my fellow firefighters. "Yeah, so that means this is fire department property, which means it's public property, which means you can't refuse to let me use it for community assistance." She grabbed the handle again, looking smug. I was so tired that it took me a moment to process the absolute logical gymnastics she just performed. "Brenda, that's not how any of this works. The logo doesn't mean the fire department owns it. It's my personal snowblower that I own with my personal money. I just put the station logo on it." "I don't believe you. You're trying to keep community resources to yourself. Are you serious right now? Completely. Either you let me use this snowblower to help Mrs. Patterson, or I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting tonight to discuss your refusal to cooperate with community welfare initiatives. And I'll be filing a report with the fire department about misappropriation of public equipment." The absurdity of the threat might have been funny if I wasn't running on 2 hours of sleep and had been dealing with a 3-alarm fire the night before. "You know what? Go ahead and call the fire chief. His number's on the city website. Tell him Owen Tanner has fire department stickers on his personal snowblower. See what he says." She pulled out her phone, and I realized with mounting disbelief that she was actually going to do it. I'd been bluffing, sort of, figuring she'd back down when called out. But Brenda Morrison didn't get to be the most feared HOA president in suburban Milwaukee by backing down from anything. "Fine, I will." She stepped back, already scrolling on her phone. I restarted my snowblower and went back to clearing my driveway, trying to ignore her standing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear. The morning sun was climbing higher, turning the snow from blue-white to almost blinding. My street was a mix of single-family homes, most of them built in the early 2000s, all of them subject to Brenda's ever-expanding interpretation of HOA authority. I'd gotten violation notices for leaving my garage door open too long, for having a wreath on my door past January 15th, and once for parking my truck at an angle she deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. I was making good progress when I noticed Brenda waving at me again. I tried to ignore her, but she stepped directly into my path, forcing me to kill the engine again. "Well," I asked. "I couldn't get through to anyone at the fire department, but that doesn't change the fact that you're being uncooperative. I'm implementing HOA Protocol 7. "What the hell is Protocol 7? Emergency Equipment Sharing Mandate. "I'm officially notifying you that your snowblower is needed for community safety, and refusal to comply will result in daily fines of $50 until you cooperate." I pulled off my hat and ran my hand through my hair, which was probably sticking up at weird angles from a combination of hat hair and snow melt. "Brenda, you can't just make up protocols. That's not legal. It's in the updated handbook, the one we voted on last month." "The meeting I couldn't attend because I was working. That's not my problem. Ignorance of the rules isn't an excuse." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head like the anger management counselor we'd had at the station recommended. "Okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to finish my driveway. Then I'm going to go inside and have coffee. Then I'm going to get my shovel, walk over to Mrs. Patterson's house, and clear her driveway by hand because apparently that's easier than having this conversation. And you're not touching my snowblower. Then you leave me no choice. She pulled out her phone again and took several photos of me, the snowblower and the fire department logo. I'm documenting this for the HOA board and the fire department. You'll be hearing from us. She turned and marched back across the street, her fuzzy boots leaving a trail of footprints that were already starting to fill with fresh snow. The sky was gray and heavy with the promise of more precipitation. The Weather Service had predicted another 6 to 8 inches tonight. February in Wisconsin was brutal, and we were only halfway through the month. I finished my driveway in silence, my mind churning through the confrontation. I'd dealt with Brenda before, but this felt different. There was a vindictiveness to it that went beyond her usual HOA power trips. Maybe it was because I'd been voted onto the HOA board last year by neighbors who were sick of her unilateral decision-making, and I'd been a consistent vote against her more outlandish proposals. Or maybe she was just having a bad day. Either way, I had a feeling this wasn't over. After putting the snowblower in my garage and making sure it was locked up, I trudged across the street to Mrs. Patterson's house. She was a sweet lady who'd lived in Oakwood Meadows since the development was built, and she always had cookies when I stopped by to check on her after big storms. Her driveway was shorter than mine, and I made quick work of it with my shovel, declining her offer of hot chocolate because I was barely keeping my eyes open. "That Brenda came by earlier," Mrs. Patterson said from her doorway, wrapped in a thick robe. "Demanded I call you and insist you help me immediately. I told her I was perfectly fine waiting a few hours and that you'd been at work. She didn't like that. Yeah, we had words about it. She's getting worse, Owen. Last week she tried to tell me I couldn't hang my bird feeders because they weren't architecturally consistent with the neighborhood. I've had those feeders for 20 years. Did you take them down? Absolutely not. I told her she could pry them from my cold, dead hands. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled. She didn't appreciate that either. I couldn't help but grin. Good for you. You watch yourself with her, though. She's got a mean streak and she doesn't forget. Back at my house, I finally got my coffee and collapsed on my couch. My phone buzzed with a text from my buddy Jake, another firefighter at Station 47. Heard Brenda Morrison called the station asking for Chief Reynolds. Said something about misappropriated equipment. What did you do? I typed back. Put a station logo on my personal snowblower. Apparently that makes it public property now. Lol. Chief told her to stop wasting his time. She didn't sound happy. She never does. I dozed off for a few hours, the kind of deep sleep that comes after pulling a double shift, and woke up to my phone ringing. It was Marcus Webb, another board member of the HOA and probably the only reasonable person on the entire committee. "Owen, man, you need to check your email. Brenda's losing her mind." I put him on speaker while I pulled up my inbox. There were 7 emails from Brenda, each one more unhinged than the last. The first was a formal notice of violation for unauthorized use of public safety markings on private equipment. The second was a demand that I attend an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night. The third through 7th escalated from there, including threats of lawsuits, formal complaints to the city, and a personal attack on my character that mentioned my consistent refusal to embrace community values. "Is she serious with this?" I asked Marcus. "She's called 3 board members already. She wants you removed from the board and fined. I tried to talk her down, but she's on a warpath." What actually happened? I explained the morning's events, and Marcus sighed heavily. "This is about the vote last month, isn't it? When you blocked her proposal to mandatory community beautification fees." "Probably. But I'm not apologizing for that. She wanted to charge everyone $300 a year for landscaping we didn't need." "I know. I voted against it too. But now she's got ammunition because you refused community assistance or however she's spinning it. I didn't refuse. I told her I'd help after I finished my own driveway. You and I know that's reasonable. But Brenda's going to paint it like you were hoarding resources while an elderly woman suffered. Mrs. Patterson is fine. I already cleared her driveway. Doesn't matter. Brenda's narrative is already out there. She sent emails to the entire neighborhood. I pulled up my community listserv and found Brenda's message. A masterpiece of manipulation that made me sound like a heartless monster who'd refused to help a vulnerable senior citizen during a winter storm. The comments below were mixed. Some people defended me, mentioning that I was always helpful and that Brenda was overreacting. Others, probably the ones who'd never had to deal with her wrath, agreed that community equipment should be shared. "This is insane," I muttered. "Welcome to HOA politics." "Look, the meeting's tomorrow at 7. You should probably come prepared to defend yourself, and maybe bring documentation that the snowblower is yours. I have the receipt and the credit card statement, and probably the manual with the serial number. Bring all of it, and Owen. Don't lose your temper. That's what she wants." The next day at the station was busy enough to keep my mind off the HOA drama. We had 2 medical calls, a false alarm at a grocery store, and a minor car accident on I-94. Chief Reynolds pulled me aside during lunch. "So I got a call yesterday from some HOA president," he said, his weathered face showing amusement. "Said you were misappropriating department property. She saw the station logo on my personal snowblower and decided that meant it belonged to the city." Reynolds laughed, a deep rumble that made his whole frame shake. "I figured it was something like that. I told her she was wrong and to stop wasting emergency resources on nonsense. She tried to argue with me. That sounds like Brenda. She said something about filing a formal complaint. I told her to go ahead, and that I'd have our legal department send her a cease and desist if she continued harassing city employees. That shut her up quick." He clapped me on the shoulder. "But seriously, if she keeps bothering you, let me know. We've got protections against this kind of thing." The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a bland building at the entrance to our development that mostly hosted children's birthday parties and the occasional yoga class. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation, and the parking lot was already half full. Word had apparently spread about tonight's entertainment. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a table where the board sat. Brenda was already there, shuffling papers and talking in a low voice with 2 other board members I recognized as her usual supporters, Patricia Hendricks and Susan Carmichael. Marcus gave me a subtle nod from his seat at the end of the table. I took a seat in the 3rd row, right behind Tom and Linda Franklin, neighbors who'd always been friendly. Tom turned and shook his hand. "This is ridiculous," he whispered. "Brenda needs to get a hobby." "I'm pretty sure terrorizing the neighborhood is her hobby," Linda added. The room filled up quickly. I was surprised to see so many people until I realized this was probably the most exciting thing to happen in Oakwood Meadows since the great mailbox painting debate of 2024. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, armed with her purse and a determined expression. Brenda called the meeting to order at 7 sharp, rapping her gavel like a judge in a courtroom drama. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency session of the Oakwood Meadows HOA Board. We're here to address a serious matter of community safety and cooperation." She launched into a prepared statement that made yesterday's confrontation sound like I'd personally endangered the entire neighborhood. According to her version, I'd aggressively refused to help a vulnerable senior, hoarded public safety equipment, and violated the spirit of community cooperation that makes Oakwood Meadows a desirable place to live. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising with indignation. Mr. Tanner's snowblower bears official fire department markings, which indicates it is city property. His refusal to allow community use of this equipment may constitute theft of public resources. I felt my jaw clench, but kept my expression neutral. Marcus had been right about not losing my temper. Mr. Tanner has been a problematic board member since his election, Brenda went on. He consistently votes against proposals that would improve our community, and he shows a blatant disregard for the rules that the rest of us follow. Tonight, I'm proposing we take formal action. She held up a document. This is a motion to remove Owen Tanner from the HOA board for conduct unbecoming a board member, and to fine him $5,000 for misuse of public equipment and failure to comply with community assistance protocols. The room erupted in noise. Several people tried to speak at once. Mrs. Patterson stood up, waving her cane. "This is absolute nonsense," she shouted, her voice surprisingly strong. "Owen helped me yesterday afternoon, and I never asked him to do it immediately. Brenda Morrison, you should be ashamed of yourself." "Mrs. Patterson, please sit down," Brenda said coldly. "You're out of order." "I'll show you out of order," Mrs. Patterson shot back. Marcus banged his own gavel. "Everyone, please, let's handle this properly. Brenda, you've made your motion. Does anyone second it?" Patricia Hendricks raised her hand immediately. "I second." "Okay," Marcus said. "Before we vote, I think Owen should have a chance to respond." "Owen." I stood up, folder in hand, and walked to the front of the room. My heart was pounding, but my voice came out steady. Years of fire safety presentations to school kids had taught me how to speak in front of crowds. "Thanks, Marcus. I'll try to keep this brief since most of what Brenda said is either exaggerated or completely false." I opened my folder and pulled out a receipt. This is the purchase receipt for the snowblower in question. I bought it 3 years ago at Miller's Hardware on Capitol Drive. That's my name, my credit card, and my signature. I held it up so people could see, then passed it to Marcus. "This is the owner's manual with the serial number, which matches the number on my machine. And this is a statement from Fire Chief Reynolds confirming that the snowblower is my personal property, and that fire department personnel are allowed to display station logos on personal items as a matter of pride in our work." I pulled out my phone and read from an email. Quote, "Station 47 personnel are authorized and encouraged to display department insignia on personal property as a demonstration of unit pride. This does not transfer ownership of private property to the city or fire department." Miss Morrison's assertion that such displays indicate public ownership is incorrect and not supported by any city ordinance or department policy. That's from Chief Reynolds, sent this morning. The room was quiet now. I looked directly at Brenda. I didn't refuse to help Mrs. Patterson. "I told you I would help her after I finished my own driveway and had coffee. I'd been working for 48 hours straight. I helped her 2 hours later, which she's confirmed. The idea that my snowblower is public property because it has a station logo is absurd. And frankly, this whole meeting is retaliation because I don't rubber stamp every proposal you bring to the board." "That's not true," Brenda snapped, but her face was red. "Really? Because the timing is interesting. You tried to commandeer my personal property, I refused, and suddenly I'm facing removal from the board and a $5,000 fine. That seems like retaliation to me." Marcus cleared his throat. "Does anyone else have comments before we vote?" Tom Franklin stood up. "Yeah, I do. I've lived here for 12 years, and I'm sick of the HOA being used as Brenda's personal fiefdom. Owen's been a good neighbor and a good board member. This motion is vindictive, and we all know it." Several people applauded. Linda Franklin stood next. I'd also like to point out that this Protocol 7 Brenda mentioned doesn't exist in any HOA handbook I've ever seen, and I've read them all because I got tired of violation notices. It was in the amended handbook, Brenda insisted. The one you sent out the day after the vote, without giving anyone time to actually read the changes, Linda shot back. That's not how amendments are supposed to work. More murmuring from the crowd. Patricia Hendricks tried to jump in to defend Brenda, but she was drowned out by other voices. The meeting was rapidly spinning out of Brenda's control. Marcus let it go on for a minute, then banged the gavel. Okay, let's vote. All in favor of removing Owen from the board and imposing the fine. Brenda and Patricia raised their hands. Susan Carmichael hesitated, looking at the crowd, and slowly lowered her hand without voting. All opposed. Marcus and the other 3 board members raised their hands. The motion failed spectacularly. Brenda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. This is a miscarriage of justice. No, Marcus said firmly. This is a functioning democracy. Your motion failed. Now, is there any other business? Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. I'd like to propose we review all of Brenda Morrison's recent actions as HOA president for compliance with our actual bylaws, not the made-up ones. Seconded, called someone from the back. The rest of the meeting was a blur of motions and counter-motions. By the time it ended 2 hours later, Brenda had been formally censured. Several of her recent decisions had been overturned, and a committee had been formed to review the bylaws and remove any amendments that hadn't been properly voted on. Brenda stormed out before the final gavel, Patricia scurrying after her. I was packing up my folder when Mrs. Patterson approached me. Thank you for helping me yesterday, dear. I'm sorry you got dragged into all this. Not your fault, Mrs. Patterson. Brenda would have found some reason to come after me eventually. She's not going to let this go, you know. She'll find another way. Let her try. I've got documentation for everything now, but Mrs. Patterson was right. Over the next week, I received 3 more violation notices from Brenda. One claimed my truck was parked illegally in my own driveway. Another said my trash cans were visible from the street outside of designated hours, even though I'd already brought them in. The third cited me for unauthorized exterior modifications because of a tiny security camera I'd installed above my garage door. I responded to each one with photos proving the violations were false, copying the entire HOA board on every email. Marcus called me after the third one. She's building a harassment case against herself, he said. Document everything. We might need it. The situation escalated the following weekend. I woke up Saturday morning to find my mailbox had been knocked over, the post snapped cleanly at the base. It looked deliberate, not like someone had accidentally hit it with a car. I took photos and filed a police report, more for documentation than because I thought they'd investigate a broken mailbox. That afternoon, I went out to run errands and came back to find a formal notice taped to my door. Brenda had scheduled another emergency HOA meeting, this time to address my repeatedly documented violations of community standards. The meeting was set for Tuesday night. I called Marcus immediately. Can she do this? Technically, yes, but the board has to approve emergency meetings. She didn't run this by me. Let me make some calls. An hour later, Marcus called back. Okay, so she called Patricia and Susan and got them to approve it without telling the rest of us. That's procedurally questionable, but probably not enough to cancel the meeting outright. But here's the thing. I talked to Susan and she's getting nervous. She admitted Brenda has been pressuring her to vote against you on everything. I think Susan's ready to flip. What about the violations Brenda's been filing? Everyone can see they're bogus. but come Tuesday with more documentation. Photos, timestamps, whatever you've got. I spent Monday gathering evidence, taking time-stamped photos of my property, printing out the relevant sections of the actual HOA bylaws, and even getting a written statement from my next-door neighbor confirming that my truck had been parked correctly, and my trash cans were never out past the collection time. Tuesday evening arrived cold and gray, with the threat of more snow hanging in the air. I drove to the community center with a sense of déjà vu, though this time the parking lot was even more crowded. Apparently, word had spread that the Brenda vs. Owen saga was continuing, and people wanted to see round two. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Brenda sat at the board table looking grim but determined. Marcus gave me a subtle thumbs up as I took my seat. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her presentation. She had poster boards with printed photos of my supposed violations, each one labeled with dates and times. It was impressively thorough and completely misleading. "As you can see," she said, pointing at a photo of my truck, "Mr. Tanner consistently parks his vehicle in violation of Section 4.7.3 of the bylaws, which states that vehicles must be parked within designated garage areas when not in active use." I raised my hand. That photo was taken on a Tuesday morning when I was loading tools into my truck before driving to the station. The bylaw you're citing applies to overnight parking, which is clearly stated in the next sentence you didn't read. Brenda's eye twitched. The spirit of the rule is that vehicles shouldn't be visible from the street unnecessarily. That's not what the rule says, though. You don't get to interpret the spirit of rules to mean whatever you want. Marcus nodded. Owen's right. The bylaw is specific about overnight parking. Vehicles can be in driveways during the day. Brenda moved to the next board, which showed my trash cans. These cans were left at the curb past the designated collection time on 3 separate occasions. I pulled out my folder. Here are photos from my neighbor, time-stamped, showing that my cans were brought in by 7 p.m. on each of those dates. The collection time is 6 p.m. The bylaw allows a 1-hour grace period, which I was well within. Your neighbor is obviously biased in your favor. The timestamps are from his phone's metadata. They're not something we could fake even if we wanted to. This went on for 20 minutes, with Brenda presenting evidence of violations and me systematically debunking each one with documentation. The crowd was getting restless and not in Brenda's favor. People were whispering, and I heard more than one person say this was a waste of time. Finally, Tom Franklin stood up. "I've heard enough. Brenda, you're clearly using the HOA to pursue a personal vendetta. This is the 3rd meeting in 2 weeks about Owen, and every single claim you've made has been proven false. I'm formally requesting that the board censure you again and consider removing you as president." The room erupted in applause. Brenda's face went from red to purple. "You can't do that." "I'm following proper procedures." "No, you're not," Marcus said quietly. "Tom's right. This has gone too far, and actually, there's something else we need to address." He pulled out his own folder. "I've been doing some research into HOA financials, and I found some irregularities." Brenda went very still. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that the HOA account shows significant expenditures for community improvements that no one can seem to account for. There's a payment for landscaping at a property on Maple Street, but that's not a common area." "That's your house, Brenda." The room went silent. Marcus continued, "There's also payments to a company called Morrison Consulting Services. That's your husband's company, isn't it?" "Those were legitimate consulting fees for HOA management services," Brenda said. but her voice had lost its confidence. "We already have a management company that we pay. Why would we need to pay your husband's company too? And why wasn't this disclosed or voted on by the board?" Susan Carmichael spoke up for the first time, her voice shaking. "Brenda told me those payments were approved in previous years and were just routine renewals. She said we didn't need to vote on them." "That's not how it works," Marcus said. "Any payment over $500 requires board approval. These payments were thousands of dollars each. Brenda's been approving them herself using her authority as president." I watched as the implications sank in. Brenda had been using HOA funds to pay herself, essentially. That wasn't just a violation of HOA rules, it was potentially fraud. Patricia Hendricks was looking at Brenda with dawning horror. "Brenda, tell me this isn't true. You said you were just managing the accounts efficiently." "I was. Everything I did was for the good of the community." "These are just accounting matters that got mishandled. I'll pay it back if there's been a mistake." "If there's been a mistake," Marcus's voice was hard now. "Brenda, I've found over $15,000 in questionable payments over the last year alone. This isn't a mistake. This is embezzlement." The word hung in the air like a bomb. People started talking all at once, voices rising in anger and disbelief. Brenda stood up, grabbing her papers. "This is a witch hunt. You're all ganging up on me because I hold people accountable. I've done more for this neighborhood than any of you, by stealing from us," someone shouted. "I didn't steal anything. Those were legitimate expenses." Marcus was already on his phone. "I'm calling the police. This needs to be investigated properly." Brenda's eyes went wide. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. If there's a legitimate explanation, you can provide it to the authorities. But I'm not letting this slide." Brenda grabbed her coat and headed for the door, but Tom Franklin moved to block it. "I think you should stay until the police get here." "You can't hold me here. That's kidnapping." "No one's holding you, but leaving right now would look really bad." Brenda shoved past him anyway, nearly knocking over a chair in her rush to get out. Patricia followed her, looking shell-shocked. The rest of us sat in stunned silence as Marcus spoke quietly into his phone. 2 Milwaukee police officers arrived about 15 minutes later. Marcus explained the situation and handed over copies of the financial documents he'd compiled. The officers took statements from several board members and said they'd follow up with Brenda directly after they left. The meeting dissolved into small group conversations. People were angry, confused, and more than a little embarrassed that this had been going on under their noses. Mrs. Patterson sat down next to me, shaking her head. "I knew she was a tyrant, but I never thought she was a thief." "Makes you wonder what else she's been doing," I said. The next few weeks were chaotic. The police investigation into Brenda's activities expanded as more irregularities came to light. It turned out the $15,000 Marcus had found was just the beginning. Brenda had been siphoning HOA funds for nearly 3 years, using a combination of fake invoices, unauthorized payments to her husband's company, and creative accounting to hide the theft. The total came to over $45,000. She was arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Oakwood Meadows was famous for all the wrong reasons. Reporters showed up asking for comments, and our quiet subdivision became a circus for a few days. Brenda's husband claimed he had no knowledge of the fraudulent payments to his consulting company, and investigators seemed to believe him. He was a soft-spoken accountant who appeared genuinely horrified by what his wife had done. Patricia Hendricks resigned from the HOA board in shame, saying she should have caught the irregularities. Susan Carmichael stayed on but became much more diligent about actually reading financial reports. The HOA held a special election to replace Brenda and Patricia. Marcus was elected president with near-unanimous support, and a retired lawyer named Helen Graves took the other empty seat. One of Helen's first actions was to propose a complete overhaul of the HOA bylaws, removing all the weird amendments Brenda had slipped in over the years. I kept my seat on the board, and even started enjoying the meetings now that they focused on actual community issues instead of Brenda's personal vendettas. We organized a real volunteer system for helping elderly residents with snow removal and yard work. We renegotiated contracts with service providers and found we'd been overpaying for things like lawn care in common areas. We even started a neighborhood social committee that organized seasonal events, something Brenda had always opposed because she said it would lead to property damage and liability issues. The criminal case against Brenda moved slowly through the system. Her lawyer tried to argue that the payments were authorized and that this was a civil matter, not criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming, and she eventually accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony embezzlement and 2 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. The restitution part was complicated because Brenda and her husband didn't have $45,000 just lying around. Their house went up for sale, and they ended up moving out of state after everything was settled. I felt a little bad for her husband and their 2 adult kids, who had to deal with the fallout of her actions, but I didn't have much sympathy for Brenda herself. The attempted snowblower commandeering became something of a neighborhood legend. People joked about it at block parties and used it as shorthand for HOA overreach. My snowblower, the innocent catalyst for everything that followed, continued to work perfectly and still bore the Station 47 logo proudly. Mrs. Patterson made me promise to never take the sticker off. That logo led to the downfall of a tyrant, she said with satisfaction. That's historical now. Life in Oakwood Meadows slowly returned to normal, or at least a better version of normal than we'd had under Brenda's reign. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvements instead of petty enforcement. Violation notices dropped by about 90%. People seemed happier, more willing to chat with neighbors, less afraid of arbitrary rules appearing out of nowhere. I kept working at the fire station, kept clearing my driveway with my own snowblower, and kept helping Mrs. Patterson and other elderly neighbors when they needed it. The difference was that now I did it because I wanted to, not because someone was trying to force me or use it as ammunition in some bizarre power game. One evening in late March, as the last of winter's snow was finally melting, Marcus stopped by my house with a 6-pack of beer. We sat on my porch, watching the sun set and the neighborhood kids playing in the street. "You know, none of this would have come out if Brenda hadn't gone after you so hard," Marcus said. "I might never have looked at the finances if she hadn't kept calling emergency meetings and making everything so dramatic. So you're saying my stubbornness about my snowblower saved the HOA thousands of dollars? That's exactly what I'm saying. Your stubborn streak and Brenda's vindictive streak combined to expose her entire operation." I laughed. "I'll add that to my resume. Successfully defended property rights and accidentally uncovered embezzlement scheme. Don't forget survived HOA Karen's attempt at equipment commandeering." We clinked our bottles together, and I felt genuinely content for the first time since moving to Oakwood Meadows. The whole ordeal had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had also brought the community together in unexpected ways. People who'd never spoken before were now organizing neighborhood watches and garden clubs. The HOA, freed from Brenda's authoritarian grip, was actually functioning the way it was supposed to, helping the community instead of terrorizing it. Tom Franklin walked by with his dog and waved. "Hey, Owen. Heard they're doing a story about all this for one of those true crime podcasts. You going to be famous?" "God, I hope not," I called back. But he was right. A few weeks later, I got contacted by a podcast producer who wanted to interview me about the whole situation. I politely declined, but Mrs. Patterson agreed to do it, and she apparently gave them an earful about Brenda's years of petty tyranny. The episode was titled, "The HOA President Who Stole Christmas," even though it had nothing to do with Christmas, and it got picked up by several news outlets as a feel-good story about community justice. The following winter, when the first big snowstorm hit, I was out clearing my driveway with the same trusty snowblower. Mrs. Patterson had already hired a service to handle her property, paid for with some of the restitution money the HOA had recovered. I waved to neighbors who were tackling their own driveways, and several of them paused to chat and compare notes on techniques and equipment. No one tried to commandeer my snowblower. No one claimed it was public property. No one threatened me with made-up HOA protocols. It was, in short, exactly the peaceful suburban life I'd hoped for when I bought the house. It had taken a confrontation with an HOA Karen, an embezzlement investigation, and a criminal trial to get there, but we'd made it. Jake from the station stopped by that afternoon to borrow my snowblower for his own driveway. "Chief still laughs about that call from your HOA president," he said as I showed him how to work the choke. "He's told that story at 3 different departmental meetings now." Great. I'm glad my HOA drama is providing entertainment for the entire fire department. Are you kidding? It's legendary. You've got firefighters from other stations asking about the guy whose snowblower sticker exposed a fraud ring. It wasn't a fraud ring. It was one person embezzling HOA funds. Yeah, but fraud ring sounds cooler. Just go with it. After Jake left, I went inside and made myself dinner, enjoying the quiet of my house and the knowledge that my mailbox wouldn't be knocked over in retaliation for some imagined slight. The neighborhood watch we'd established after Brenda's arrest had actually cut down on petty crime, so my mailbox and everyone else's were safer than before. I thought about the whole situation sometimes, marveling at how quickly it had escalated from a simple confrontation over snow removal equipment to a criminal investigation. If Brenda had just accepted my initial answer that I'd help Mrs. Patterson after finishing my own driveway, none of it would have happened. She'd probably still be HOA president, still embezzling funds, still making everyone's life miserable with arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement. Instead, her need to control every situation and her inability to accept the word no had led to her own downfall. The fire department logo that she'd fixated on as proof of public ownership had become the symbol of her defeat. There was something poetic about that. The restitution payments trickled in over the following year. Brenda's house sold for less than expected in a slow market, and she'd already spent a lot of the stolen money on vacations and home improvements. The HOA recovered about $30,000 of the $45,000 she'd taken, which we used to replenish our emergency fund and make some actual improvements to common areas that Brenda had neglected while siphoning money for herself. We installed new playground equipment in the neighborhood park. We repaved the community center parking lot. We even put in better lighting along the walking paths that ran through Oakwood Meadows, something residents had been requesting for years that Brenda had always claimed we couldn't afford. The neighborhood newsletter, which Brenda had controlled with an iron fist and used primarily to announce new rules and violations, got taken over by Linda Franklin, She transformed it into an actual community resource with local business recommendations, profiles of interesting neighbors, and a kids section with drawings and stories. It was remarkable how much better life got when the HOA stopped being a weapon and started being a tool. I stayed on the board for another 2 years before stepping down to focus on a promotion opportunity at the fire station. By then, Oakwood Meadows had established a healthy precedent of actual democracy and transparency. Multiple people ran for each board seat. Meetings were well attended but efficient. Financial reports were posted online for everyone to review. Helen Graves, the retired lawyer, became president after Marcus moved out of state for a job opportunity. She ran the board with competent efficiency and zero drama. It was almost boring, which was exactly what everyone wanted after the Brenda years. Mrs. Patterson eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 87, surrounded by family. The neighborhood held a memorial service in the community center, and person after person stood up to share stories about her kindness, her feistiness, and her refusal to let anyone push her around. Someone mentioned her standing up to Brenda at that first emergency meeting, and the room erupted in applause. Dorothy Patterson was tougher than any HOA Karen, Tom Franklin said in his eulogy, and everyone laughed through their tears. Her family thanked me specifically for being a good neighbor and helping her maintain her independence in her final years. They gave me a photo of her standing next to my snowblower, giving it a mock salute. I hadn't even known the photo existed, but apparently she'd had someone take it the week after the whole incident. I framed it and hung it in my garage. Years passed. The story of Brenda Morrison and the Great Snowblower Incident became the kind of tale people told newcomers to explain Oakwood Meadows' history. We used to have this HOA president who tried to steal a guy's snowblower and ended up going to prison for embezzlement. Was a hell of an icebreaker at neighborhood barbecues. The snowblower itself lasted another 8 years before finally giving up during a particularly brutal February storm. By then, I'd gotten promoted to lieutenant at the station, and I used some of my bonus to buy a new one. I transferred the Station 47 logo decal to the new machine, the edges worn but still clearly visible. Jake, who'd become captain by then, laughed when he saw it. "You're never taking that sticker off, are you? Are you kidding? This sticker has been on the news in a podcast and indirectly responsible for solving an embezzlement case. It's earned its place." The new HOA president, a guy named Robert Chen who'd moved to Oakwood Meadows specifically because he'd heard we had a functional, drama-free HOA, stopped by while I was assembling the new snowblower. "Nice machine," he said. "And I love the logo. I heard the story about that." Everyone's heard the story about that. Well, just so you know, current HOA policy is that your personal property remains your personal property, regardless of what stickers are on it. We've actually got that written into the bylaws now. It's called the Tanner Amendment. I looked at him to see if he was joking. He wasn't. "You guys actually named a bylaw after me. Seemed appropriate. It covers personal property rights and specifically states that the HOA can't commandeer equipment during emergencies. We can ask nicely, but we can't demand or fine anyone for refusing. Marcus pushed it through right before he moved and it passed unanimously. I didn't know whether to be honored or embarrassed, so I settled for amused. Well, I hope it never comes up again. Same, but if it does, we're covered." The Oakwood Meadows HOA continued its drama-free existence. Occasional minor disagreements came up, as they do in any community organization, but they were handled through actual discussion and compromise rather than autocratic decrees and vindictive enforcement. It was remarkable what we'd achieved, All because one morning I'd refused to let someone take my snowblower. I thought about that sometimes during quiet moments at the station between calls. How small actions could cascade into major consequences. How standing your ground on something that seemed minor could expose much bigger problems. How a simple logo on a piece of equipment could become a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny. But mostly, I thought about how lucky we'd all been that Brenda's need for control had finally overreached itself. If she'd been just a little less vindictive, a little more careful with her embezzlement, a little less obsessed with punishing me, she might have gotten away with it for years longer. Instead, her attempt to commandeer my snowblower had been the first domino in a chain that toppled her entire corrupt operation. The snowblower sat in my garage now, shiny and new, but bearing the same logo that had started everything. Every time I used it, I thought about that February morning when Brenda Morrison had stormed across the street in her ridiculous fuzzy boots, convinced she had the authority to take whatever she wanted in the name of the HOA. She'd been wrong about so many things. Wrong about the snowblower being public property. Wrong about her authority to commandeer equipment. Wrong about her ability to retaliate against board members who opposed her. And most critically, wrong about her ability to embezzle tens of thousands of dollars without eventually getting caught. The fire department logo she'd fixated on had been her undoing in the most ironic way possible. She'd thought it gave her leverage, but all it did was draw attention to her overreach and trigger the chain of events that exposed her crimes. These days, when I teach fire safety classes to kids or give tours of the station, I sometimes tell a simplified version of the story. Not the embezzlement part that's too heavy for elementary schoolers, but the part about how a logo led to a big misunderstanding. I use it to teach about the difference between official equipment and personal property, and about why it's important to ask questions instead of making assumptions. The kids love it, especially the part where I explain that having a fire department sticker on something doesn't mean firefighters will show up to repossess your toys. That always gets a laugh. My career continued to progress. I made captain eventually, following in Jake's footsteps. I moved to a different house in a different neighborhood, one without an HOA at all, and found that I didn't miss the organization one bit. I kept in touch with people from Oakwood Meadows, though, especially Tom and Linda Franklin, who threw excellent summer barbecues. The snowblower came with me to the new house, logo still intact. By now, it had become something of a good luck charm. Fellow firefighters who knew the story would sometimes ask to borrow it, half-jokingly claiming that using the famous snowblower would bring them good fortune. I always said yes, partly because I genuinely didn't mind helping people, and partly because the whole point of the original incident was that you couldn't forcibly commandeer someone's property, but you could certainly ask nicely, and often receive help willingly given. That distinction between demanding and asking, between taking and receiving, between authoritarian control and cooperative community, was the real lesson of the whole Brenda Morrison saga. She'd never understood it, and that failure of understanding had cost her everything. The last I heard, she'd served her prison sentence and was living in Arizona with her husband, who'd stood by her through everything despite the embarrassment and financial hardship her crimes had caused. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I suspected people like Brenda rarely did. The world was full of petty tyrants who thought rules were weapons to be used against others, rather than frameworks for cooperative living. But the world was also full of people who stood up to those tyrants, even over something as small as a snowblower. And sometimes, those small acts of resistance led to justice being served and communities being healed. Winter came again, as it always does in Wisconsin. Snow fell, covering yards and driveways and streets in that fresh blanket of white that makes everything look clean and new. I fired up my snowblower, the engine catching smoothly, and cleared my driveway with the same satisfaction I'd felt that morning years ago when this whole story began. The fire department logo gleamed in the winter sun, a reminder of where I came from and what I'd been through. It was just a sticker, really, nothing special in itself. But it represented something important: the pride I took in my work, the community I served, and the principle that personal property remained personal no matter what symbols it bore. Somewhere in Arizona, Brenda Morrison was probably dealing with her own winter, though significantly warmer and drier than Wisconsin's. I wondered if she ever thought about the snowblower, about the confrontation that had been the beginning of her end. I wondered if she understood, even now, where she'd gone wrong. Probably not. But that was okay. The rest of us had learned the lesson, and Oakwood Meadows was better for it. The HOA functioned smoothly. Residents lived peacefully, and no one tried to commandeer anyone's equipment in the name of community welfare. And my snowblower, bearing its proud Station 47 logo, continued to clear snow year after year, a small piece of equipment with an outsized history. Every time I used it, I remembered that morning and smiled. It had been frustrating and exhausting and ultimately led to months of drama, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes you have to defend your snowblower. Sometimes that defense exposes corruption and transforms a community. And sometimes a simple logo becomes a symbol of resistance against tyranny, no matter how petty that tyranny might be. The snow continued to fall, and I continued to clear it, one driveway at a time, with my trusty snowblower and its infamous fire department logo leading the way.